The fire crackles, the smell of smoke fills the air. Inside the house, panic. The family has left, and the German Shepherd is left with 3 helpless kittens. Everything seemed like an ordinary day until something terrible happened. A short circuit, and the house was engulfed in flames. Only the dog, on the brink of death, knows what must be done. But here she stands before a choice: to save herself or risk her life for those who cannot save themselves. What will this brave shepherd do when everything around her is burning? The fire shows no mercy, but she decides to risk everything. The sunlight filtered through the high windows of the house, breaking into thousands of tiny rays that played on the walls and furniture. In their soft light, the polished wood looked especially alive, as if the space itself was breathing life. The day was quiet and peaceful, just like any other day when the family was home. They had just left for a trip abroad, leaving their house, pets, and life in the caring hands of the housekeeper, who was supposed to look after things in their absence. The German Shepherd, named Leia, and 3 little playful kittens remained at home in their usual surroundings. Leia had always been an excellent guardian, loyal and devoted to her home and owners. The dog felt right at home here. Her size and strength commanded respect, but her gaze always showed kindness and attentiveness, especially when she looked at the kittens. These little fluffballs, who had only recently arrived in the house, were completely helpless at first, but each day they became more playful and curious. Leia, understanding that no matter how hard they tried, the kittens wouldn't be able to handle tough situations on their own, became their protector. She took on the role of the older, more experienced and caring friend. Their life flowed in simplicity and routine, but within this everyday existence there was much comfort. In the evening, the house was filled with warm sounds. The housekeeper would turn on the radio. The kittens would purr and run around the room, and Leia would calmly watch them from her corner. It was a simple but peaceful life. The housekeeper, though a stranger in the house, loved the animals. Her attitude towards them was sincere and kind. She played with the kittens, cleaned the house, and always made sure Leia didn't feel lonely. As it is known, dogs not only love attention, but also care. Leia received what she needed: food, walks, and affection. However, on that day, everything changed. Time passed, and the sun began to slowly hide behind the horizon. Leia noticed how the clouds in the sky gradually turned gray, and the wind started to pick up. Nothing seemed to forewarn of trouble, but the dog felt that something was wrong. She had always been able to sense things, and today her intuition did not fail her. Meanwhile, the housekeeper went to the store to buy groceries, intending to replenish the supplies. She always did this at the same time, and Leia and the kittens stayed at home. The house was quiet and cozy, but there was something strange, even unsettling, about this calmness. Leia looked around, trying to understand what was happening. She smelled things she hadn't noticed before, a bitter metallic scent mixed with something slightly chemical, but unclear. The dog shifted uneasily, sitting down with her tail tucked. The usual, everyday events were being disrupted by something invisible. At that moment, a short circuit happened in the kitchen. A power source, possibly an old wire or a faulty socket, began to burn, leaving behind a sharp, acrid smoke. At first, it was faint, but it quickly intensified, spreading throughout the house. Within seconds, thick clouds of smoke filled the air. Leia, in terror, felt the panic rise, but her instincts didn't fail her. The dog immediately understood what was happening. She couldn't just sit there and watch as the world around her collapsed. Despite this, the kittens, still unaware of what real danger was, continued to play and run around the house. Their soft fur gleamed in the light of the setting sun, and their tiny paws carelessly scampered across the polished floor. Leia nervously twitched her ears, sensing the growing danger. For the first time in a long time, she felt vulnerable, but at the same time, her resolve grew stronger. She had to protect them, these little kittens, and the house that had become her real sanctuary. Leia stood up and walked down the hallway. She sniffed the air, but something wasn't right. The smell of burning grew stronger and the smoke thickened. She took a few steps towards the exit, but it turned out the door was already blocked by flames. Leia stepped back and tried to wake the kittens. They didn't understand her distress and continued playing. This only added to her worry. Meanwhile, the housekeeper, who didn't sense any danger, returned with the groceries. When she approached the house at first, she didn't notice anything, but when she opened the door and stepped inside, she was faced with a scene that shocked her to the core. She couldn't believe what she saw. The fire that had spread across the kitchen and the thick smoke that had filled the entire house. She tried to open the windows and doors, but the smoke was too dense and the heat was too intense for her to handle. Panic took over her, and she decided to go inside, but her efforts were in vain. Every attempt to leave the house seemed more difficult than ever. The tongues of fire, like hunters, had already clung to the wooden beams, and the walls began to crack. Confronted with the unpredictable force of nature, the housekeeper retreated, losing consciousness from the smoke and heat. Everything was happening so quickly that she didn't have time to scream or call for help. Leia, in panic, ran from room to room, trying to find an exit. She barked, trying to attract attention, but all she heard in response was the crackling of the fire and the sound of falling debris. Despite all the danger, the dog didn't waste a second. She couldn't allow herself to sit idly by when those around her were depending on her. Leia knew it was her duty to save the kittens and the housekeeper. But what could she do? The fire raged everywhere, and the only choice left was to risk her life. Leia ran into one of the rooms where the kittens were still playing, unaware of what was happening. Running up to them, she desperately tried to lead them outside, but the smoke was so thick that she could barely distinguish anything around her. Everything seemed doomed, but Leia didn't give up. Her instincts were stronger than her fear, and she knew she had to act quickly. Minutes passed. The house was engulfed in flames, and despair began to fill the dog's heart. But she couldn't leave her little friends and the housekeeper. Her life depended on every step, but Leia was determined to complete her mission to the end. Time passed, but the house was still filled with tense silence. The huge house, once so cozy and safe, now seemed lifeless. The fire, which had begun its destructive march, was still the center of attention. Leia, pushing away panic, focused on the main task, saving herself and the little kittens. The dark, suffocating smoke, which had gradually filled the house, became denser and denser. Leia knew her time was running out. If she didn't take action right now, everything she knew and loved could be destroyed. She tried to find an exit, but even the simplest movement became a real test. It seemed like the house itself was pulling her back into its deepest and darkest corners, places she didn't want to end up in. The kittens, still not understanding the gravity of the situation, were running and meowing in the next room, sincerely unaware of the scale of the disaster. Leia called to them several times, but their playful behavior kept them from immediately responding to her concern. She worried that the fire would spread too quickly and that they wouldn't make it out of the house in time. She felt responsible for them and couldn't leave them in trouble. Every move she made became more desperate as the smoke grew thicker and the fire seemed to get closer with each passing second. Leia ran through the corridors, seeing how the fire slowly, but relentlessly, filled the space. In one of the rooms, something caught her attention. A small stool near the window, on which, as usual, one of the kittens was lying. Leia quickly jumped to it and forcefully pulled the kitten, lifting it by her teeth, clutching its little body as if it were her own life. She ran through the house with it, but despite all her determination, she felt the time slipping away. But just as it seemed that an exit had been found, something happened that completely changed her thoughts. While Leia was already heading toward the exit, the housekeeper, who had returned with the groceries, entered the door, only to be confronted with an unbearable sight. The fire had engulfed the walls, the floor was covered with smoke, and the windows, through which sunlight had once streamed, were now covered in soot. For a moment the woman froze, unable to comprehend what had happened. But this brief moment of confusion came at too high a cost, and her steps became unsteady. Leia saw her and immediately rushed toward her, trying to understand what was going on. All this panic, chaos, smoke, and heat, it was too much for her. She hadn't yet realized just how dangerous the situation had become, and in that moment, the housekeeper, having lost consciousness from the smoke, fell straight to the floor, leaving Leah alone on the front lines. As is known, dogs are resilient, but Leah, despite all her resolve and strength, felt her heart tighten. It was the moment when she understood that she had to act quickly, or everything would be lost. The dog didn't hesitate. She knew that if she didn't save the housekeeper now, she wouldn't survive. Leah, holding the kitten in her teeth, struggled to make her way through the thick smoke. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate. She knew that every step could be her last. But despite the risks, she was ready to move forward. The fire raged, and now it was everywhere. Suddenly, Leah felt her paws growing heavy and the air became even hotter. She couldn't stand still anymore. She ran into the room with the kittens and tried to direct them to the exit. But the fire spared no one. It quickly consumed everything in its path. Leah felt her body overheating, but despite that, she kept moving. The thick smoke made it difficult to navigate, and the dog could barely see anything. It seemed that all the sounds had become muffled, and the world shrank to the smallest dimensions. She felt the kittens press against her, and without thinking, she pulled them outside. But time was not waiting, and by the moment she managed to get them into the fresh air, the fire was still consuming the house. Leah knew that this was just the beginning, and her task was far from finished. Outside it was dark, cold, and unsettling. Leah sat next to the kittens, watching the house closely. There was no panic in her eyes, only focus, knowing she couldn't leave her own until the situation was safe. But her heart was still filled with worry. The housekeeper was inside, and Leah couldn't look away or think of anything else. All her thoughts were concentrated on finding a way to save the woman. The sound of sirens and the lights of fire trucks which had begun to approach offered a brief moment of relief. However, this moment didn't last long. The state of the house worsened, and Leah knew that staying aside was not an option. She stepped back toward the house, once again deciding to risk herself for those inside. The sound of ambulance and fire truck sirens grew louder, and their lights tore through the darkness, illuminating the gloom that hung over the house. Leah stood outside, her breathing quick and her muscles tense to the limit. Panic swirled around her, but her gaze was firm and her actions decisive. She still hadn't left her kittens, and despite all her efforts, the fire continued to threaten the lives of her entire family. The housekeeper, still lying on the ground, couldn't move. Leah knew she couldn't back down. Dogs can be strong and resilient, but in moments like these, they become not only braver but also full of resolve. Leah could no longer just stand aside and watch the house burn. She continued to watch the entrance, hoping to see the firefighters who could handle the fire and save her owner. Several minutes passed before the first firefighters started approaching the house. At that moment, Leah was on the brink of despair. The fire was spreading with astonishing speed, and all she could do was stand and bark like a mad dog. Dogs can't speak in words, but their behavior can say much more. Leah continued to make desperate sounds, barking to draw the firefighters' attention, but they, despite her persistence, continued to stand at a distance. When Leah ran to the nearest firefighter, she clutched a kitten in her teeth and approached the man. His face was serious, and he instantly understood what was happening. Leah didn't waste time explaining. All she needed was for the firefighters to understand her intuitive gesture. She approached him closely and barked as loudly as she could, pointing at the house, and then turned back toward it, constantly looking over her shoulder to ensure they had understood her message. Everything happened in a rush, on the edge of panic. The situation was so complicated that the only way to act was to follow her instincts. Finally, the firefighter, realizing that Leah was pointing out the danger, decisively moved toward the house. He commanded his colleagues to work faster and more seriously. Leah remained in place, watching as the firefighters scattered around the perimeter of the house. But inside her, the only question that echoed was, "Will everything be okay?" It was the moment when the dog, without wasting time on hesitation, decided to return to the burning house to find and save the housekeeper. The firefighters began to break into the house, realizing that with every new step, the fire became even more dangerous. Leah felt the warmth coming from the flames, and her paws carried her down the hallway despite everything. She didn't think about her own safety. The task was clear: save the people who were important to her. She tried to reach the housekeeper, but the path was blocked. The smoke grew thicker, and it was hard for Leah to see anything. But, without losing her confidence, she kept moving forward, knowing that nothing could stop her from saving those she cared about. Several long minutes passed before Leah found the housekeeper. She was still unconscious, lying right by the door where the fire was especially intense. But despite that, Leah didn't hesitate for a second. With her strength, with her determination, she carefully approached the woman and took hold of her sleeve. Leah dragged her toward the exit, not thinking about the risks to herself. Each step became heavier, each moment was dangerous, but she couldn't stop. By the time the firefighters finally managed to reach the housekeeper, she had started to regain consciousness. Leah, breathing heavily, sat on the floor beside her, her body trembling from fatigue and strain. The external danger, which had seemed unbearable just moments ago, was now a bit farther away, but Leah's anxiety still echoed in her mind. The ambulance arrived quickly. The doctors, assessing the housekeeper's condition, began providing first aid. Meanwhile, the veterinarian approached Leah and examined her. Leah was exhausted, but no signs of serious injury were found on her body. Although she looked tired, her eyes still held confidence. She had saved those she loved. Meanwhile, the firefighters continued their work. Although the fire was under control, the aftermath of the incident was too horrific to be forgotten. The house, where Leah had once felt safe, was now covered in ash and ruins. Leah stood nearby, her tail pressed against her body, and her eyes reflected care and exhaustion. All she wanted now was to return home, to her familiar corner. But right now, her main task was to stay by the side of those who were her family. The firefighters began packing up their equipment, and Leah sat, watching as the house in her eyes lost everything it had once had. In her soul, there remained only one goal. She had succeeded. She had saved her friends. She had saved the housekeeper. Despite the horrible threat, she remained true to herself and to those she protected. And though there were too many people around, Leah knew that her true reward was the ability to be with those who mattered to her. The sounds of sirens, the cries of firefighters, and the sharp footsteps of rescuers, amidst desperate attempts to extinguish the flames, became an inseparable part of the night's chaos. The darkness and smoke gradually dissolved into the blue of the night, but the nightmare experienced by this house would remain in the memory of those who witnessed the tragedy and those who showed heroism in that terrifying moment. Leah, paws clenched and pressing herself to the ground, continued to watch as the firefighters and medics worked, as though her own battle had ended, but her heart wouldn't calm. She understood that it was just the beginning, that with each passing hour, her resolve only grew stronger. It was dark and cold outside, and everyone continued working, but Leah sat still, freezing at every sharp sound. Every shout, every step, every moment of this chaos made her heart beat faster, and her tail twitched nervously. The firefighters, who had just managed to put out most of the fire, continued their work, but Leah's eyes remained focused on the housekeeper. She was nearby, having been pulled out, but she couldn't understand what was happening. Her face was pale, with signs of thermal burns and injuries on her arms and body. Everything around was blurred and tangled, like a terrible nightmare from which one couldn't wake up. Leah felt that everything depended on her. She couldn't leave the housekeeper, who lay on the ground without help, but she also knew she couldn't save her alone. She couldn't bear another misfortune if something happened. Soon, when help was already near, the medics took control of the situation. A doctor rushed past Leah, desperately trying to calm the housekeeper, but the dog couldn't stop thinking about her, about how she should have stayed by her side. She couldn't leave her, just as she couldn't leave the kittens, who had already been brought outside. She checked on them again and again, making sure everything was okay, and again tried to convey to everyone that her work was not yet finished. Soon, the firefighters began pulling out all the necessary equipment to clear the house from the fire. Leah kept watching the house, seeing how its main parts were collapsing, how the walls were beginning to sink, how only ruins remained of what was once her home. It seemed that at that moment, Leah realized that the house was no longer home to her. It had become just a reminder of the monstrous catastrophe she had gone through. The veterinarian, who came up to Leah and examined her, couldn't hide his surprise. Externally, the dog was remarkably calm, despite having literally survived death and disaster. Leah was shaken, but despite that, her eyes didn't lose their determination. Her strength was running low, her body was exhausted, but the inner core of the dog remained unshakable. She knew her place was by the side of those she had saved, and she needed to do everything possible to ensure they all survived. When the housekeeper was taken away by ambulance, her life still hung by a thread. She was in critical condition, and the doctors were fighting for her life. But Leah didn't leave her. She kept an eye on every movement, every breath. She hoped that everything would be okay. She believed in salvation and knew that her role in this story was far from over. Meanwhile, the kittens, saved and safely brought to the veterinarian, began to slowly recover. Leah still stayed by them, never taking her eyes off them. These little fluffballs were her responsibility. They had survived the fire, but they needed recovery. Leah continued to watch over them like an older brother, understanding that her task wasn't limited to just saving them. She had to be there, support them, and care for them. Despite all her worries, Leah remained true to her role, to be the guardian, the protector, the savior. This was the moment when her true nature revealed itself in full. Every movement she made was driven by instinct, every decision, a desire to help those who needed her protection. The housekeeper, the kittens, and even the elderly people standing nearby all felt this, the irresistible force coming from this devoted and strong dog. A few hours later, when the situation was under control, Leah finally allowed herself to relax a little. She knew she needed to restore her strength to be ready for any further battles if they were still to come. But in her mind, there remained one important question. Will everything be okay? This was her motivation, her fuel. She didn't leave the kittens, the housekeeper, or her duty until she was sure everyone was saved and safe. When the fire was finally extinguished and everyone had more or less calmed down, the same darkness remained on the streets as it had during the night, darkness filled with fear and doubt. However, now there was something different in the air, a strange sense of relief, a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. But for Leah, there was neither relief nor joy. All she needed at that moment was the knowledge that her owners and the kittens were safe. They had all survived the ordeal, but there was one question. Who was saved and who still needed help? When the firefighters and medics took the housekeeper away in the ambulance, Leah returned to her house. Almost nothing remained of what had been her home just the day before. Destroyed walls, charred remnants of furniture, and shattered windows, that was her only memory of the house she once loved. But despite the physical destruction, there was no regret or fear in her soul. She didn't know what to do with this place, but all she felt was the desire to return to those she had saved. Leah stood on the street beside the veterinarian who was carefully examining her, checking her condition. The dog stood still, showing no fear or anxiety, but the veterinarian could see her body trembling from exhaustion. He said she had gone through real stress and needed some time to recover. But Leah wasn't ready to rest. She was determined. The kittens, the housekeeper, and her entire life were more important than anything. The veterinarian checked Leah again, and only then did he agree that she needed recovery. But the dog stood with such an expression that it was impossible to deny her the help she needed. Leah was ready to oversee everything and always stay close to those who loved her, who were dear to her. Meanwhile, the kittens who had been saved and brought to the veterinarian were safe. but their bodies needed treatment and recovery. They still didn't understand what they had been through, but their lives went on, and Leia, as a loyal guardian, never left them. The kittens were her main priority. She held back the surge of emotions and watched every movement of theirs. Every step she took was focused on ensuring they felt safe. Soon, the housekeeper, who had survived the horror, regained consciousness. She was in the hospital, but despite the severe injuries and burns, her condition stabilized. She remembered everything that had happened, but it was hard for her to believe the reality of what had occurred. She wondered how to cope with everything, what to do next, and what the future held. But despite the pain and worry, the housekeeper was grateful to be alive. In her eyes was gratitude for Leia, who had saved her, and that was enough for Leia. Meanwhile, Leia was already ready to return home, to those who were waiting for her. She was true to her role, protector, savior, faithful dog. But in her eyes, there was not just determination, but something more. The understanding that she had done everything she could. She had saved everyone. And now, with the danger past, she could finally feel at peace, knowing that her mission was complete. The housekeeper, now in stable condition, was able to find out how everything had gone. She told the doctors how it all happened, how the dog had handled the situation on her own and saved her and the kittens. The doctor was stunned to hear this story, but he wasn't the only one who was amazed. The firefighters who had participated in putting out the fire also couldn't hide their astonishment and admiration. Leia became not just a dog, but a true hero. When everything had settled and the housekeeper returned home, Leia still couldn't stray from her task. She didn't leave the kittens and continued to care for them like a true older sister, without fatigue and without looking back at what she had been through. Leia was brave, devoted, and her actions became a true act of heroism. Her story soon became known throughout the city. Leia, this remarkable dog, earned respect and recognition. But despite her newfound fame, she remained the same dog who had once saved the kittens and people from the fire without thinking about her own safety. She became an example of courage and heroism. A few days later, when the housekeeper and the kittens had recovered, Leia was finally able to rest a little. But not for long. Noticing that her help was still needed, she returned to her duties. She didn't seek rewards or recognition. She simply did what she felt was her duty. In the city where Leia had once been just a dog, now she had become a true hero. Events unfolded rapidly. The burst of fire that destroyed the house brought attention to the incredible bravery and loyalty of this remarkable shepherd. At the moment, Leia rushed into the flames, risking her life for those she loved. She had already become a symbol of courage, will, and self-sacrifice. After saving the housekeeper and the kittens, her story spread quickly throughout the city, and now everyone knew her name. Leia didn't seek attention. She didn't crave fame. She didn't understand that her actions had become an example for everyone. But the townspeople, hearing of her heroism, began to see her as something more than just a dog. Now she had become a symbol of hope and bravery. Leia continued to live her usual life, caring for the kittens, guarding the house, but her actions were recognized, and that earned her respect and admiration. A few days after the incident, the local authorities decided to honor Leia for her bravery. A small ceremonial event was organized in the city where Leia received a medal for courage. Leia didn't understand what the medal meant, but her eyes, full of focus and gratitude, showed that she was happy only because her actions had saved lives. She didn't seek recognition, but when her tail happily wagged at the sight of the medal, it became clear to everyone. For her, it wasn't important. Leia was happy that she had saved those dear to her. The press began writing articles about her. Leia was featured on the pages of newspapers, and her photographs filled the screens of televisions. In the center of the city, an exhibition was organized, where a photo of her saving the housekeeper was displayed in a showcase. Thank you letters hung on the walls, and everyone acknowledged her bravery. During this time, Leia became even more recognizable and beloved. But despite this, she remained the same devoted dog she had been before the incident. Soon, the firefighters who had saved the housekeeper offered Leia a place in their team. Unofficially, of course. They couldn't officially include a dog in their service, but Leia happily spent time with them. Every time the firefighters responded to a call, Leia accompanied them. She watched their work, observed their actions, and became an integral part of their team. She genuinely cared for the firefighters, and, just as always, she remained loyal to her duty. Leia understood perfectly that her place was with those who did important work. The firefighters had become not just colleagues, but true friends. They willingly let her assist in putting out fires, controlling the situation, and being a loyal companion at the scenes of incidents. Leia helped them search for victims, and her dog abilities became a real asset to the team. She proudly showed her skills, knowing that she was doing work that truly mattered. With each passing day, Leia became more well-known. Soon, television channels took notice of her heroism, and she was invited to a program to discuss her feat. She sat next to the housekeeper and the firefighters, and even though she didn't understand the questions, her eyes spoke volumes. Everyone around her was proud of her and her courage. Leia sat upright, proudly holding her head high, showing no emotions. But inside, she felt a strong satisfaction that everything had ended well. This was her time, her recognition. She wasn't part of the show or the discussion, but her actions became what inspired and amazed people. After Leia became the hero of the city, her life returned to its usual rhythm. The kittens, who had regained strength after the stress they had gone through, were playing happily again, and the housekeeper, having recovered from her injuries, returned to her duties. Although she needed time to cope with the aftermath of the disaster, she was thankful for fate that she was still alive and that such a brave dog had been by her side. Together with Leia, she was able to survive this horror and get back on her feet, knowing that they had both become true heroes of the city. Leia, despite her popularity, did not change her nature. She didn't seek fame or attention, but her actions remained in the city's history as a symbol of courage, loyalty, and devotion. Recognition and medals were just a superficial reflection of the inner strength that drove Leia. She was simply a dog doing her duty, and despite all the fame, she was content with what she had done for those she loved.